Okay, so in the next one, we need to check if a list is what is here called rectangular. So what is a rectangular list? It's a list of lists, but where each of the sublists, like the innermost list here, have the same number of elements. So in this case, it's a list of two lists, like a list here and a list here. And the first list has 3 elements and the second has 3 elements, so it is a rectangular. In this case, it's a list of two lists. The first list has 3 elements and the second has 4, so it's not rectangular. In this case, it's a list. It's a list of 3 lists, and each of the sublists has 3 elements, so it is rectangular. And in this case, it's a list again of 3 lists, but this one has 3, this one has 3, and this one has 0 elements, so it's not rectangular. So that's what this function is doing. So, and this is when you have a list of lists, it's called a nested list in this notation. So we're supposed to work in rectangular.py to solve this problem. So I'm just going to copy this function here, copy this example of the function, and then I'm going to open the file and try to solve it. So I go back to Files, Rectangular, and there's no example, so I'm just going to insert the example in the bottom. Should be true, and I call the function like this. Is it? I don't know, I feel I'm missing a parenthesis or something like that. Maybe I'm not. Okay, so let me solve it, and you can see some of my earlier videos for how I work with the debugger. But let me just put in a print statement here where I print out the nested list. So if I run it in the debugger, just going to run the entire file, print out, like it's just going to run all the lines of code here one by one, starting at the top, like Python normally runs code. So it gets to this line, it calls my function, it prints out the nested list. That's basically what I call the function with, this variable. And then it returns none because the function has no return statement, so that's the behavior that Python selects in that case, and that means that this becomes none and it prints it out. I want to implement this function, so I insert a breakpoint inside the function. I run the debugger again, and what happens is that the moment it executes a line with a breakpoint next to it, I can just insert these by clicking on the margin. It will actually stop. So now it stopped. I go to the debug console because now I can start experimenting. Okay, so how am I going to solve this problem? Well, we can first notice that even though this is a nested list, and that's the first time we see that in this exercise, we can just index it as normal and get the first list out and the second list out, and that's actually not that different. So what I want to basically check is if the length of the first list is equal to the length of the I pressed enter prematurely, is equal to the length of the second of the nested lists. That's what I basically want to check in this case, because there are 2 elements of the list. But of course this kind of idea begins to break down the moment I have arbitrary number of nested like sublists here. So I don't know there's just going to be 2. Okay, so how do I approach in that case? Well, I might approach it by trying to break the problem down into smaller problems. So let's suppose that I start by asking myself, how can I create a new list which has as many elements as this outermost list has element, that is 2 elements in this case, but each element is just the length of the corresponding list in the nested list. So I want basically in this case I want to create a list that looks like this. No, listed list of 0. I want to create this list basically, but I want it to work for arbitrary number of elements. So why am I even thinking about that? Well, I'm thinking about that because to my mind it's easier for me to eventually check if a list just has unique elements, like if it just has the same element repeated many times, or whether it has different elements. So if it has the same element repeated an arbitrary amount of time, it means that all of these sublists have the same length. So in this case it would be 3. Whereas if some of them are different, it means that this condition is violated. So that's why I'm going to start by defining this simpler problem. So sublist length. So I'm going to proceed in the usual fashion that I done in the previous exercises. I start by defining this list as the empty list, and then I'm going to add each of these lengths to it one by one. So eventually I want to call this list 3,3 for sublist length. Okay, so the natural idea here is to create a for loop over the lists in empty lists. So let me just check that I can do that and it works as I expect. So I call them L for list, and I just loop over the elements in nested length, and then I print out each element L. Okay, so does that work? Nested list has this value, and then let's try to run these 2 lines of code and see what happens. So I select them and press Shift-Alt-E, like this. Prints out each element, and I can see, okay, they are just lists. And that basically means that I can print out the length as well. I can just call the length function. Let's just confirm that it works. Shift-Alt-E again. I select the line, Shift-Alt-E. So now it prints out the length. So that means that I can take my sublist length, and then I can append these length to it, and I just do that using a construction that I used a couple of times today. Namely, I create a singleton list and just add it to the end. Okay, so now I remove my little, let's actually keep my little print statement. I select all of this code again, because now I want to see what happens when I run all of these lines with the given value of nested list. So I select them, Shift-Alt-E. On Mac, it would very likely be Shift-Command-E, by the way. So it printed out the same as I had before, but it should also have updated this sublist length. So now we can actually see that it's equal to 3.3. So that kind of accomplished my goal. Like I've created a list that has these elements: the length of the first list, the length of the second list, and then potentially the length of the third list and the fourth list, and so on and so forth. How can I check if all of them are the same? Well, this is where I'm going to use a trick, and why I actually selected that approach, because it allows me to reuse an idea that I already used, and I like that. The less that I need to explain, the better. Because I can get the maximum value of this list using the max. Right? We can just confirm that that works. That gives me 3. And I can get the minimum value. And if you think about it, if the maximum and the minimum value are the same, all numbers must be the same, because otherwise they couldn't possibly agree. So what I can just say is that I can make this comparison if the maximum is equal to the minimum of sublist length. So if this is true, and I'm just going to copy paste it into the debug console, well, they all have the same length. So this actually allows me to compute the result of the function. I just need to return whether this is true or false. So let me clean it up a bit by removing this and removing the print statement, and then I should actually be good. So I stop the debugger, I remove the breakpoint, I save the file, and I press Ctrl S, and then I can just run the file again, and it's true. So that's good. Of course, we haven't checked the other conditions, but that's why we have testing. So I go to the tests, I guess that this is the right test, run it, and it worked. That was fortunate. Okay, good, cool. Okay, let me stop here and then we'll move on to the next one.